In topic 16, we're going to talk about the Avignon papacy in France. Believe it or not, the papacy has not always been in Rome. There is a period of history in the Roman Catholic Church where the papacy itself splits, in which you have not just one pope, but two popes, and in some cases, three popes. From the years 1300 to 1500, right up really to the time of the Protestant Reformation, we have this very lousy time in the church. And obviously the history we've been talking about up to this point with the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, none of this none of these things are high points within Roman Catholic Church history. But when we get into the late medieval period, the church is really going to have to come to terms with itself. It's had some bad popes. It's made some very bad decisions. It's upset a lot of people. It's been criticized from within and from without. This is also a period in church history where all of Europe is dealing with the consequences of the Black Death or the Black Plague. So 1300 to 1500 isn't just a lousy time in the church. It's really a lousy time in the history of Western civilization or European civilization, or perhaps more correctly, Western European civilization. It's in this period of time that we see the growth of the Avignon papacy. What happens is from the years 1305 to 1377, you have a papacy in Avignon, France, because the Roman Pope decides to move to southern France. This seems very, very strange to a lot of people, but basically, the Roman Pope moves to southern France because the weather is better. It's nicer there in Avignon than it is in Roman Italy. So this is a very, very strange move, and the consequences of it are also drastic, because what happens is, even though the Pope moves to southern France, this allows rival popes to challenge the Pope by saying, wait a minute, if you've moved all the way to southern France, can we create another papacy where it rightly should be in the city of Rome? So between the years 1378 and 1417, a rival papacy is created in Rome, and this becomes part of what is known as the Great Western Schism in the Church. Now, we've already had a Great Schism, and that schism was between the Eastern Church in Constantinople and the Western Latin Church in Rome. The East and the West split. They excommunicate one another. And this causes all kinds of issues, especially with the rise of Islam. But within the Latin Western Church itself, there is another great schism in which essentially what you have is, once the Pope moves the papacy to France, someone says, well, wait a minute, that's not where the Pope should be, so is that Pope even legitimate? And the conclusion is no, so we're just going to start a rival papacy here in Rome. And again, this becomes known as the Great Western Schism of the Church. Now, this is Avignon today, and if you look at a picture of this, you can see why somebody might want to move there, and why somebody might want to move the papacy there. But when you think about this, there's a pretty good case to be made for this being almost a blasphemous thing to do, because if you're going to say that I sit on the throne of Peter, or I speak from the throne of Peter, why would you be in Avignon in southern France? Peter died in Rome. The tomb of St. Peter is supposed to be in Rome. The tomb of Paul is supposed to be in Rome. What's significant, in other words, about Avignon? And the response is going to be there's just nothing that's significant about Avignon. And so a lot of people are thinking, the Pope really needs to get out of France and come back to Rome. But the problem is, the Pope who is in Avignon is actually the legally elected Pope, so anybody that tries to rival him is not going to be the legally elected Pope. It's also during this period of time that you start to see a number of individuals who would not label themselves as Catholics, nor label themselves as Christians, that start to caricature the papacy. And these are caricatures that are going to continue on through the Protestant Reformation, and even in some respects down through the modern period. There's one individual in particular that'll just give you a taste of this, a man named Petrarch, who was an Italian humanist, and his years are 1304 to 1375. As a humanist, he started to look at the church institution. The Catholic Church as an institution that was unfair, that was evil, that was causing all these problems for society. We would be better off without it. These same sorts of things are going to be said during the European Enlightenment, plural, that we'll talk about next week. But Petrarch began to use this terminology, calling the church the whore of Babylon, referring to the book of Revelation, where Rome is what is actually meant, the city of Rome is what's meant by that term, whore of Babylon. And when he started talking about the Roman Catholic Church that way, basically he coined this phrase, the Babylonian captivity of the church, which is essentially what scholars down to this day think of when they think about this split between the Roman papacy and the papacy in Avignon, as this is the Babylonian captivity of the church. And so what Petrarch is saying is that this split has turned the papacy into the Babylon of the West. And of course, these are not very, very nice things to say about the church. And you can see here, again, that there's not just an assessment of the church from within, there's also an assessment from the church without. And this is why I say the late medieval period is not a really flowery, glowing period of time for the Roman Catholic Church. Well, I already pointed out that one of the reasons you simply leave Rome as Pope is because the weather is nicer in southern France. And I'm really not kidding about that. That was one of the decisions that went into leaving Rome. But there were some other reasons that are definitely just as practical, if not more so, maybe even more pragmatic. One of the reasons the Pope left Rome for Avignon is because there was a lot of danger in Italy because of German invasions into Italy that started to occur in 1311 and then again in 1328. And Roman popes felt that eventually they might be the target of these German invasions, so the easiest thing to do would be to get out of Rome and go somewhere else. Avignon was a neutral place. It was sort of like Switzerland, if you want to think of it that way. And the other thing that was going on in this period is that the papacy was being staffed by a multicultural staff. There was a growth in French staffing and French culture going on within the papacy. So it kind of made sense with the possibility of a German invasion or two, the weather being nicer, Avignon being much more neutral, to just simply move the papacy over to France. Well, this whole Babylonian captivity of the papacy is really where you start to hear about the really bad reputation, or reputations, I should say, plural, of popes. Now, we don't have time in an introductory course to go through all of these types of popes, but things got really bad in terms of the behavior of the popes in this late medieval period. And this bad reputation is really well-deserved. In fact, if any Catholic historian tells you it's not well-deserved, they're wrong. It's well-deserved. There are all kinds of strange things going on in the papacy at this point. There's adultery being committed. There's popes sleeping with prostitutes. If you think of it, you've got it. If you've watched, various Showtime shows about this period of time in the papacy, or if you've watched CNN recently has had a whole thing on the popes. When you watch the episodes about the bad popes, what they're telling you is true. So just use your imagination and you can figure it out. But besides things like sex scandals and all of that, one of the big problems is that the church was becoming extremely corrupt, especially in terms of patronage, especially in terms of power and money. And one of the things you had to do in order to get the Pope's attention is you had to pay, as they say, to play with the Pope. To give you an example of this, if you wanted the Pope's ear and you wanted your court case to move through the system faster than it's moving, you had to go and do something for the Pope. Money, a favor, etc. You help me, I'll help you. You call in a favor, I'll let you call in a favor at some other time. And this was just basically how the business of the papacy worked in the late medieval period. Now, as bad as this is, and it's really bad, it was good for the economy of southern France. Because when the papacy moved to Avignon and moved to southern France, that meant sort of an economic revival for the area of southern France. But it also meant an economic downturn for Rome because the papacy was no longer there. Even though there are a lot of bad popes in this era, there are also some good popes. And I want to highlight them because the bad are just really, really bad. For instance, one very important pope, 1334 to 1342, is Benedict the XII. Benedict the XII tries to reform the church, but there's only so much. As strange as this may seem, there is only so much he as pope can do. He fights nepotism. Nepotism becomes a huge, gigantic problem in the Roman Catholic Church during the medieval period. What happens is family members are promised certain important ecclesiastical posts. Now, you might be asking, how is that possible? Well, it's because there are bishops, priests, even popes having children out of wedlock. So nepotism is obviously where you put your family members in power or in charge, or you promise them certain positions within your papacy or within your diocese. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what's going on in this period. Is there are bishops that have had children out of wedlock, but the children that they've had, they give those children prominent positions within the church. Benedict XII says no to this, that this cannot be done. Nepotism must be stopped. He also fights against something known as absenteeism, which is where you have one bishop, but the bishop is bishop of two places. You cannot be a bishop of two dioceses, but this is what was happening in the medieval period. And so what this sometimes meant is if you were a bishop of two dioceses, you were neglecting one diocese over the other. And Benedict XII says, no more of this. We're done with this. And there was also a lot of competition going on from bishop to bishop, priest to bishop, etc. And Benedict XII wanted to put an end to this. So there are individuals within the church that are trying to reform it, but even popes can only do so much. Another important pope was Innocent VI, 1352 to 1362. He fights absenteeism. He increases the moral standards of bishops, priests, and himself, and he reduces the curia, the Roman curia. Urban V, whose dates are 1362 to 1370, briefly returns to Rome, and it's in this period of time that two women come along, Bridget of Sweden and a Dominican named Catherine of Siena, who, in a very prophetic way, acting like a prophet, go to the popes and say, this has got to stop. You need to go back to Rome. Let me show you an icon here, or a painting here of Catherine of Siena. She's very, very important in the Dominican tradition. She is a mystic and a very bright, very brilliant woman. But she, in many respects, is responsible for getting the Pope to leave Avignon and go back to Rome. And again, I always find some of these things very, very intriguing, that there are a lot of times in church history that church history moves along, or something is fixed, or something is reformed because a woman shows up telling a powerful man, you need to go and do this. So don't forget that a large part of the story of Catholicism includes women who are doing really great things. So this Great Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, let me kind of give you the narrative for how this all came about. This is not, as I said, a schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. That has already happened. But the Great Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 is a schism between the papacies in France and in Rome, southern France and in Rome. Avignon and Rome. And believe it or not, in 1409, and I'm not going to go into any detail on this, while Avignon and Rome are at it with one another, a third papacy is established. So as I said, this is not a good time for the Roman Catholic Church because its power structure is fracturing like crazy. It's not as stable as it once was. The Great Schism comes about because of two conclaves, twin conclaves, that occur in the year 1378. What happens with the cardinals who are part of this conclave is they can't agree on who should be pope. Now, according to canonical law, they need to keep going until they can agree on a pope, until they can come to some sort of agreement on this. But they can't come to an agreement, so they end up with a pope named Urban VI, whose years are 1378 to 1389. Right from the start, Urban VI is a compromise candidate, but he's also a flawed pope. And the people aren't happy with the choice of Urban, so there's a riot before the election of this pope, because the big problem with Urban is he's not Italian. And this is going to be a problem the papacy faces all the way down even into modern times, is that you basically have to have an Italian or a European pope, or people are going to be very, very upset by this. This is why today it's so significant that Pope Francis, who's from Latin America, is pope, because that really was breaking with precedent. Usually the pope has to be Italian, or at the very least European. But you go back to the medieval period, everybody still wants an Italian pope, and Urban VI was not Italian. So, the problem here is that if you elect an Italian pope, that's going to tick off the French, and if you elect a French pope, that's going to tick off the Italians. Well, everybody's upset with the election of Urban VI because what they find out is after they have elected Urban VI, they find out that Urban VI is mentally disturbed, that there really is a problem with Urban VI, that he is not just a compromise candidate, not just a flawed pope, but he has a problem. He has mental instability. What happens, just long story short, is the College of Cardinals realizes they're going to have to get rid of Urban VI. It's upsetting too many people, but at the same time, the fact that he's mentally disturbed means we need to remove him. So they start the process for removing Urban VI, and they end up engaging in a second election. And then chaos ensues. Everybody essentially starts excommunicating everybody else. If you're on the French side, you're excommunicating the Italian side. If you're on the Italian side, you're excommunicating the French side. And it just becomes one gigantic, large, big mess. It becomes so problematic that Europe splits over which pope are we loyal to. Are we going to be loyal to a pope in Avignon, or are we going to be loyal to a pope in Rome? And then eventually in 1409, you'll have a third option. Well, countries start lining up behind different popes. Monarchs start lining up behind different popes. This could be really problematic if you go to war, because if monarchs are lining up, countries are lining up behind different popes, it means that the countries and monarchs will lend their armies to one pope or the other, to one papacy or the other, if they get into a war. This gets so bad that in Spain, in Toledo in Spain, this pronouncement is made that pretty much sums all of this great Western schism up. The Latin is pro illo qui est verus papa, for the true pope whomever he is. That's kind of the motto, and it's sort of meant to be tongue-in-cheek, because the reality is people don't really know who the real pope is. And this is why I've said a couple of times that It's the Avignon papacy, it's the Great Western Schism that makes one wonder if apostolic succession, the unbroken line from one pope to the next, from Peter all the way down to Francis, has it really maintained itself, or has it at times been broken? Well, obviously, the Roman Catholic Church wants resolution to all of this. The hope that the College of Cardinals had is that one of these popes, either someone in Avignon or someone in Rome, is that one of them would abdicate his throne for the greater good of the church. Or, more practically, the hope was one might die. And if one dies, the cardinals would then acknowledge that the pope who's alive is the one true living pope. Well, the cardinals are really left with trying to settle this whole problem. So what happens, especially after 1409, when they end up realizing there's going to be a third papacy, is they call the Council of Constance. The Council of Constance lasts from 1414 to 1418. The Council of Constance is a chance to basically break all of the papal rules and hit a reset button. This might seem very, very strange, but essentially what happens is the cardinals elect a pope named Martin V, whose years are 1470 to 1431. What are they doing? It's very, very simple. They're telling the pope in Avignon and they're telling the pope in Rome, we're just done with this and we're starting over. We're electing somebody else. The Roman pope, because of this, abdicates his throne. Martin V is put in his place. He deposes the pope in Avignon. All the rules are broken, but there is stability all of a sudden, and there is a recovery of the papacy. Now, what makes this such an entertaining period is that this, even though the Council of Constance helps give stability to the church, what people are starting to see here is the vulnerability of the Roman Catholic Church. And they're also starting to see from without and from within that this system needs to be reformed. But the question is, what does that mean and how is that going to look? In our next lecture, we are going to meet a man named Martin Luther. Luther is one of the individuals that ends up creating the Protestant Reformation, but his initial intention was to reform the church from within. And remember, there had been voices in the Roman Catholic Church for a very, very long time. St. Francis, St. Dominic, saying, this church needs to reform itself or it's going to fall apart. Well, that's essentially what's happening here, is people are starting to see the cracks in the system. And the Great Western Schism shows those cracks perhaps more than anything else. Now, it would have been helpful if the church had reformed itself in the late medieval period, but it does not. The actual Catholic reform of the Catholic Church is going to come after the Protestant Reformation. We'll have to wait for that. But for now, with Martin V, there is some sort of papal recovery and papal stability. But, as I said, this is not a high period, a high point in the life of the Church, and things are about to get worse.